"I can clean your house for a plate of food," the boy said, his voice trembling. "I'm starving." He stood barefoot in the desert dust, staring up at the scarred Apache man, unaware that his knock on that door would change both their lives forever. This is only the beginning. What's coming will shake you. Hit like, leave a comment, and let's dive in. The August sun rose slowly over Red Ridge, a forgotten little town that looked like it had sprouted straight from the sun-baked clay of New Mexico. Mud brick homes were scattered without order along sandy paths, like seeds flung by the wind and left to grow wherever they landed. Time moved differently in that place. Days were counted by the position of the sun, and the seasons by the blooming of desert cactus. That morning, the heat had already begun to press in, promising no mercy. The air was bone dry, not a single cloud in the endless stretch of sky. The only shadows came from a few scraggly trees, stubborn enough to grow here and there, their tiny leaves trembling in the hot breeze drifting in from the desert. Elias stirred awake as he always did well before sunrise. For the past 3 years, his life had followed the same rhythm. He would rise in the dark light, the fire brew a strong, bitter coffee in a battered tin kettle, and sit quietly on his porch to watch the world come alive. His home, built by his own hands from adobe, was plain and sturdy, its thick walls keeping the heat at bay during the day and holding warmth through the cold desert nights. It sat tucked away at the edge of an unnamed path, half concealed behind 2 large rocks that stood like silent sentinels. Elias was a tall man, broad-shouldered with work-worn hands. His skin bore the color of rain-soaked earth, his face marked by small scars, fragments of old battles he never spoke of. Strands of gray streaked through his long black hair which fell past his shoulders. But it was his eyes, dark and heavy with a sorrow that seemed to have no end, that told the true story of his soul. 3 years. 3 long years since he had gone hunting in the northern mountains, only to return and find ash where his village had once stood. 3 years since he learned that his wife Elira and his young daughter Amaya had been slaughtered along with many others by greedy men who viewed Elias's people as obstacles to be erased. And 3 years of living with the unbearable guilt of not being there to protect them. Since that day, Elias had chosen solitude. He couldn't bear to live among his tribe anymore. Every face, every tradition, every voice only reminded him of all he had lost. He left the mountains and settled in Red Ridge, where no one questioned his past, and people treated him with the wary respect given to dangerous strangers. He spent his days alone tending a small garden of medicinal herbs, knowledge passed down from his grandmother, making remedies he occasionally sold to the villagers, reading animal tracks in the sand to see what had wandered through in the night. It was an empty life, but it was all he could handle. That August morning, as he sipped his coffee and watched a coyote drink from the plaza's well. In the distance, a sound broke the silence, light tapping on wood. Knock, knock, knock. Elias froze the cup halfway to his lips. For a second, he thought he imagined it. Who would knock on his door this early? The townspeople avoided him, and he preferred it that way. He waited, thinking maybe it was just the wind brushing a branch against the wall. Then it came again, soft but steady. Knock, knock, knock. Setting his cup down, Elias rose slowly to his feet. His bare soles made no sound on the compacted dirt floor as he moved toward the door. He paused, one hand on the weathered handle, drawing in a deep breath as he readied himself to face whoever stood on the other side. When he pulled the door open, the glare of the morning sun hit him straight in the eyes. Elias instinctively lifted a hand to shield his face, squinting as he looked downward to see who had knocked. That's when he saw him. A boy, no older than 8, stood quietly just a few steps from the threshold. He wore a faded cotton shirt that might have once been blue, but had long since turned a dusty gray, patched with bits of mismatched fabric in several places. His shaggy brown hair looked like it had been combed with his fingers, and no mirror tufts sticking out at odd angles. His bare feet were coated with the reddish dust that clung to everything in the town. But it was the boy's eyes that stopped Elias cold. They were far too large for his narrow face, a deep, near black brown that shimmered with something rare, a mixture of fear and courage. Eyes like those belonged to someone who had witnessed more than a child, should yet refused to let it break him. The boy met Elias's gaze without blinking, holding it with surprising intensity. Elias could see the nervous tremble in his small hands, the way he bit his lower lip as if bracing himself to say something that mattered. Still, he didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't show the fear he must have felt standing before a scarred Apache stranger. Finally, he drew a long breath, lifted his chin with quiet resolve that stirred something long buried in Elias's chest, and spoke in a soft but steady voice. "I can clean your house for a plate of food." The words landed like stones breaking the still surface of a quiet lake. For an instant, Elias didn't see a boy. He saw Amaya, his daughter, who would have been the same age if she were still alive. The same fire in the eyes, the same brave tilt of the chin, the same slight angle of the head when asking something serious. The pain hit so swiftly and deeply that Elias had to lean against the doorframe to steady himself. For 3 years he had avoided children, avoided anything that might awaken the memories he had fought so hard to bury. And yet here stood a boy, small and bold, asking for help the only way he knew how. "What's your name?" Elias asked, his voice rougher than expected. "Lucas," the boy replied, offering the faintest of smiles for the first time. "Lucas Bennett." "Lucas." Elias repeated slowly, letting the name settle on his tongue like honey on warm bread. "Why aren't you in school, Lucas?" The boy's eyes finally dropped. "Can't go right now. I gotta take care of other things." There was a quiet sorrow hidden behind the way he said it in the deliberate choice of words, and Elias understood instantly this child was carrying burdens far too heavy for such small shoulders. Saying nothing more, Elias stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. Lucas hesitated, eyes darting past the threshold, then took a cautious step forward. Elias's house was humble but tidy. A hand-carved wooden table stood in the center of the room, flanked by 2 simple chairs. Along the walls, shelves held clay jars packed with dried herbs, and the warm scent of lavender and sage lingered in the air. In one corner sat a small fireplace, and near it, a narrow bed covered with a woven blanket adorned in traditional Apache patterns. Lucas glanced around with quiet curiosity, careful not to touch anything. He moved slowly, respectfully, like someone used to not being welcomed into strange places. "Sit here," Elias said, motioning to one of the chairs. "ChatGPT, Danai. I'll go get you something to eat." "No, sir," Lucas spoke up quickly, shaking his head. "Work first, then eat. That's what we agreed." Elias stopped halfway toward the kitchen and turned to look at him. The boy stood beside the chair, his small hands folded neatly in front of him, waiting. There was a quiet dignity about him that deeply moved Elias. Despite clearly needing help, despite being just a child, he wasn't looking for pity. He just wanted to earn his way. "No," Elias said gently. "Food comes first. You can't do a good job on an empty stomach." Lucas blinked, surprised. It was obvious he wasn't used to kindness, especially not from strangers. "Are you sure I'm sure?" Elias headed into the kitchen and returned a moment later with a clay bowl filled with warm corn porridge, the same large batch he always made in the morning, an old habit from when he used to cook for a family. He placed the bowl in front of Lucas, along with a smooth wooden spoon, worn down from years of use. The boy stared at the food, then glanced up at Elias, then back to the bowl. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the spoon. "Thank you," he whispered, and began to eat. Elias sat across from him and watched. Lucas ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as if it were the first real meal he'd had in days, and it likely was. Between bites, he would close his eyes and smile just a little as though he were storing the taste in his memory. "Good?" Elias asked. "It's delicious," Lucas replied, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You cook really well." "My wife taught me," Elias said before he could stop himself. The words came out too fast, and for a moment the ache in his chest returned sharp and familiar. But there was a quiet comfort in saying her name aloud and speaking of Alira to someone who asked for nothing in return. When Lucas finished eating, he used a piece of tortilla to clean the bowl so thoroughly it looked freshly washed, not wanting a single drop to go to waste. Then he stood and looked around the room. "What do you need cleaned?" he asked. Elias pointed toward the windows coated with a thin layer of dust that dulled the sunlight. "If you can get those to shine, you'll have done a fine job." Lucas smiled, then a real smile that lit up his whole face. "I'll make 'em sparkle like clean river water." For the next 2 hours, Elias watched as Lucas worked with care and determination. The boy climbed onto a chair to reach the higher corners, wiping the glass with a damp rag he rinsed and wrung out over and over in a basin. He didn't speak. He was focused, stopping now and then to inspect his progress, deciding if it was clean enough. There was something captivating in watching him. The way he bit his tongue when he concentrated, how he hummed a soft tune Elias didn't recognize, and the way he smiled to himself whenever he managed to scrub away a stubborn spot. It was like watching a flower bloom in slow motion. While Lucas worked, Elias returned to his usual place on the porch and picked up a piece of wood to carve. He wasn't crafting anything in particular, just letting his hands stay busy while his mind wandered. But for the first time in 3 years, his thoughts weren't clouded by death and grief. Instead, he found himself reflecting on how strange and oddly comforting it felt to have another person moving around his house, filling it with soft sounds that made the place feel alive again. As the sun began to lower and painted the sky in shades of orange and rose, Lucas stepped into the doorway. His hands were raw from scrubbing a wet patch soaked the front of his shirt, but his grin said it all. He was proud. "All done," he said, beaming. Wanna-See Elias stood and followed him inside. The windows sparkled like polished gems, flooding the room with golden light. The change was striking. The house looked brighter, warmer, more like a home. "You did an excellent job," Elias said, and he watched the way Lucas's eyes lit up with the praise. "Thank you." "You're welcome, sir." Lucas wiped his hands on his shirt and stood there for a moment, uncertain now that the task was complete. Elias noticed a hesitation in the way the boy held himself, like he had something to say, but didn't quite know how to begin. He waited, giving him space. Finally, Lucas took a deep breath and met his eyes. "Mr. Elias?" "Yes, my mom's sick." The words came out like a whisper filled with both fear and fragile hope. Elias felt a tightness in his chest. He had suspected there was more to this visit, something deeper that explained why a child so young was wandering alone through town, offering labor in exchange for food. "How sick is she?" Elias asked softly. Lucas lowered his gaze and began fidgeting with his fingers. "She's had a fever for days now. She can't get out of bed. Barely eats anything. I go out in the mornings to try and find food for the both of us, but I don't know what else to do anymore." His voice wavered toward the end, and Elias could see he was doing everything he could not to cry. A child trying hard to stay strong, carrying a weight far too heavy for someone so young. Elias knelt down so he could meet Lucas at eye level. "Where do you live?" "At the end of the street in the little house with the blue door," Lucas replied, and for the first time a flicker of hope sparked in his eyes. Can you help her? I heard you know how to make medicine." Elias was quiet for a moment, studying the brave boy who had knocked on a stranger's door, worked hard for a meal, and now stood here asking for help for his mother with the same unwavering resolve. For 3 years, Elias had kept to himself, hiding from people, from memories, from pain. But looking at Lucas, something stirred deep in his chest, an old instinct to protect, to heal, to have purpose again. He stood and walked over to the shelf where he kept his herbs. Carefully, he picked out a few bundles of dried leaves sage to break the fever, chamomile to soothe echinacea root to restore strength. He placed them all in a soft leather pouch he'd made long ago. "Let's go see your mom," he said, and for the first time in years, he felt like his life had direction again. Lucas's smile was so wide it nearly split his face in two. "Thank you, Mr. Elias. Thank you." And so, on that golden August afternoon, a solitary Apache man and a brave young boy began a walk that would change both their lives forever. The house with the blue door sat at the far edge of a road that felt more like a forgotten trail. Red desert sand mixed with hardened dirt, worn down by countless footsteps of those who had nowhere else to go. The house itself was humble, built from old wooden planks that had long faded under the ruthless sun. Gaps between the boards let in narrow shafts of light, and the palm-thatched roof whispered sad stories whenever the wind passed through. Lucas led the way, his bare feet knowing every crack and stone in the path. His hands trembled not from cold, but from the swirl of hope and fear in his chest. What if his mother was worse? What if Elias couldn't help her? What if... "Everything's going to be all right, son," Elias said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "We'll take care of her." Lucas glanced back at him and nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He pushed open the blue door, which creaked like a wounded voice, and stepped into the dim light of the house. The smell hit Elias first, a blend of sweat fever and quiet desperation. It was a scent he recognized all too well. The smell of sickness left untreated, of poverty, unable to afford medicine, of silent suffering locked behind thin walls. Mama, Lucas whispered, approaching a narrow bed that took up most of the one-room home. "I brought someone to help you." The woman stirred slowly, every movement clearly draining what little strength she had. When she finally turned her head, Elias saw a face that had once been beautiful, now worn thin by illness and struggle. Her dark hair was matted against a sweat-soaked pillow, her skin pale like candle wax, and her sunken eyes widened in shock at the sight of an Apache man standing in her doorway. For a long moment that stretched on endlessly, neither of them said a word. They simply looked at each other. Two strangers brought together by pain, both unsure of what would happen next. Isabel had grown up hearing stories about the Apache tales filled with violence raids and men who came in the dead of night to take away women and children. Her weak hands instinctively clutched the edge of the worn blanket, pulling it up to her chin in a gesture of self-protection. "Mr. T, be afraid," Elias said, his voice much softer than he expected. He remained still in the doorway, giving her time to adjust to his presence. "I'm here to help." To help, Isabel's voice was barely more than a whisper, hoarse from the fever. Who are you?" "My name is Elias. Lucas told me you weren't well." She turned her gaze to her son, who had moved to sit beside her and was now holding her hand. "Lucas, what did you do?" "He gave me food, Mama," Lucas replied. "And when he found out you were sick, he wanted to come help you. He knows how to make medicine." The man standing in Isabel's home didn't match the terrifying images that had haunted her childhood stories. Yes, he was tall and strong, but his movements were deliberate and gentle. His large hands remained open and visible, far from anything that could be mistaken for a threat. And then there were his eyes, carrying a sorrow so deep she recognized it instantly. The same sorrow she sometimes saw staring back at her in the mirror on days she could manage to sit up. "May I come in?" Elias asked politely. "Or would you prefer that I leave?" Isabel hesitated. Every warning she'd ever heard about men like him screamed at her to run. But Lucas held her hand with quiet trust, and something about the way Elias waited for her permission, honoring her fear, made her slowly nod. Elias stepped into the small room as though he were entering sacred ground. His eyes took in everything quickly: the narrow bed where Isabel lay, a small table cluttered with scraps of food. Lucas had likely managed to find a bucket of water in the corner, and a few garments hung on a nail in the wall. It was the home of people with little, but who took care of what they had with love. He approached the bed, carefully, stopping a respectful distance away. "How long has she had the fever?" 3 weeks, Isabel answered faintly. "It started out mild, but it's gotten worse." Elias finished for her, nodding. Can you show me where it hurts the most? Isabel pointed to her forehead, her chest, and her stomach. Elias didn't touch her. He only observed, taking in the pallor of her skin, the constant sweat on her brow, the short, labored breaths, as if the air itself were too heavy to take in. I'll make a remedy, he said, opening the worn leather satchel he had slung over his shoulder. This is white sage. My grandmother used it for fevers like this. Your grandma, Lucas asked, curiosity lighting up his face. She was a healer, Elias explained. She taught me that every plant has a spirit, and if you know how to listen with your heart, it'll tell you how it can help. He moved to the table and began preparing the medicine. His large hands worked with surprising tenderness, selecting the dried leaves, gently crushing them to release their oils, explaining every step to Lucas, who watched with quiet fascination. Sage clears what's sick inside, Elias said, placing a kettle over the small brazier that Lucas kept burning. Chamomile calms what's been stirred up. Together they'll help your mother rest and bring her fever down. Isabel watched in silence, caught between fear and hope. There was something calming in the way this man moved, something almost mesmerizing. His touch was careful, his actions precise, and the way he spoke to Lucas wasn't like a stranger. It was like an uncle, kind and steady. When the tea was ready, Elias poured it into a clay cup he found on a shelf. The steam rose with a strong but soothing scent. It's going to taste bitter, he warned as he stepped toward the bed, but it'll do its job. Isabel tried to sit up but lacked the strength. Lucas quickly grabbed some pillows and propped them behind her back. Elias handed her the cup and waited patiently as she sipped it slowly, grimacing with each swallow. Thank you, Isabel murmured when she finished. I'll come back tomorrow, Elias said, packing up his herbs. If the fever breaks overnight, that'll mean the remedy is working. As he began preparing to leave, Isabel couldn't hold back the question that had been pressing at her since the moment he entered. Why, she asked suddenly. Why are you doing this? Elias paused at the door and turned. Lucas was still at the bedside holding his mother's hand, and for a fleeting second, Elias saw his own wife and daughter in that very place long ago in another life. The ache hit him like a blow, and he had to lean against the doorframe. Because someone has to, he said at last, and slipped outside before the tears gathering in his eyes could fall. That night, for the first time in weeks, Isabel slept without fevered dreams. And when morning came, her fever had eased, and she managed to sip a little water without getting sick. Lucas cried with relief as he touched her forehead and felt it cool, no longer burning like an ember. Just as promised, Elias returned this time with more healing herbs and a small pot of hot cornmeal porridge. He found Isabel sitting up in bed, still weak but alert, gently combing through her damp hair which Lucas had washed earlier in a basin by the bed. How are you feeling? Elias asked as he placed the small pot down on the table. Better, Isabel replied, and for the first time she smiled. Just a small smile, but real. Much better. The fever might come back later in the day, Elias warned gently while preparing another batch of herbal tea. But it'll get a little easier every day. And that's exactly how it happened. With each sunrise, Isabel grew a bit stronger, her color slowly returning, her spirit inching closer to the woman she'd been before illness had taken hold. Elias showed up every morning without fail, always bringing something: healing herbs, warm food, firewood for the brazier, clean cloths to refresh the bed. Lucas bloomed like a plant after rain. With his mother on the mend and Elias quietly taking care of them both, he returned to the boy he had once been, curious, talkative, overflowing with questions about the world. He would follow Elias around the small house, watching closely as the man prepared salves and teas, learning the names of the plants, helping however he could. Why is white sage white? He asked one morning, helping Elias organize the herb bundles. Because it soaked up moonlight for many nights, Elias replied with total sincerity. The moon gives plants their healing power. Really? That's what my grandmother always told me, Elias said with a soft smile. And she never lied. Isabel listened to these exchanges quietly, realizing how gently Elias spoke to her son. Patiently, kindly, as if every question mattered. Slowly, the fear she'd once felt around him began to shift, giving way to something else: curiosity. Who was this man? Why did he live alone? Where did all that tenderness come from? By the end of the second week, now strong enough to sit up for hours at a time, Isabel began to talk more. She asked about the plants he used, about the grandmother who taught him, about how he came to know so much about healing. Elias answered, but always briefly, as though every word about his past had to be dragged up from somewhere deep. "Did you grow up in the mountains?" she asked one afternoon while he prepared a poultice for a scrape Lucas had gotten on his knee. "Yes," Elias nodded. "Up north where the air's clean and the plants grow tougher." "So, why did you leave?" Elias stopped what he was doing. He went still for so long that Isabel thought he might not answer. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a sadness that landed heavy in her chest. "I didn't have a reason to stay anymore." She understood instantly that her question had pressed on something raw, so she didn't push further. But from that day on, she watched Elias more closely. She noticed how his eyes misted when Lucas laughed too hard. She saw how sometimes he'd stop mid-sentence, as if lost in a distant memory. She noticed the tiny tremble in his hands when checking a forehead for fever. This big, quiet man carried a sorrow just as deep as her own. By the end of the first month, Isabel could walk through the house without tiring. By the second, she was helping Elias prepare the remedies, learning the things he'd carried alone for far too long. By the third month, the little house with the blue door had become a home. Elias spent most of his days there now. In the mornings, he'd bring in firewood and light the stove. In the afternoons, he'd gather fresh herbs from the nearby hills, always bringing Lucas along to teach him the secrets of the land. And in the evenings, the three of them would sit around the brazier sharing meals and stories from the day. Uncle Elias, Lucas asked one night, curled in a blanket with his head resting on Elias's shoulder, "Why don't you have a family?" Isabel, mending a shirt nearby, looked up. It was the question she'd wanted to ask for weeks, spoken now with the simple innocence only a child could pull off. Elias didn't answer right away. He stared into the dancing flames for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and low, as if the words were too heavy to lift. "I had a family, a wife named Elira, and a daughter, Amaya. She was your age, Lucas." "Where are they?" Lucas asked quietly. "They're with the spirits now," Elias replied. "They were killed 3 years ago, while I wasn't there to protect them." The silence that followed was thick and still as fog. Isabel felt her chest tighten with sympathy. Lucas scooted closer to Elias, his little arms trying to wrap around the man. "Is that why you came to live here?" Isabel asked gently. Elias nodded. "I couldn't stay in the mountains. Everything reminded me of them. So I came down here, and somehow ended up in this place." "You miss them?" Lucas asked. "Every single day," Elias answered truthfully. Then he looked at the two of them. "But now I have you both, and that makes the hurt a little easier to bear." Isabel felt tears sting her eyes. For 3 months, this man had cared for them without asking for anything in return. He had slipped into their lives so naturally she had nearly forgotten what it was like before he came. And now she realized something else: he needed them too. Somehow they had become his healing just as much as he had been theirs. "Uncle Elias," Lucas murmured sleepily, "can we be a real family? Forever." Elias pressed a kiss to the top of the boy's head. "If you want me to." "We do," Isabel said, her voice thick with emotion. "We definitely do." That night they became a true family, not by law, not by blood, but through a quiet love that had taken root and grown between them like a wildflower no one planted, but somehow found a way to bloom anyway. And with time, the stories came. Stories kept hidden for years, wounds that needed light to finally begin to heal, truths that could only be shared with those who had already become family. Isabel was the first to share her story. One rainy night, as the wind howled outside and raindrops drummed steadily on the roof, she spoke softly about her life before she arrived in that little town. She spoke of her husband, Edward, a kind and honest man who had worked on a small ranch near Guadalajara. They had been poor, yes, but happy in the life they built together, until the cholera epidemic swept through and took Edward along with hundreds of others. After he died, I thought the worst had already happened, she said, her eyes fixed on her hands as they worked through an embroidery stitch. We didn't have much, but I knew how to work. I could take care of Lucas and myself. But then the colonel came. Lucas added quietly, already familiar with parts of the story. Yes, Isabel said, her face tightening. Mr. Laureano Vasquez. He showed up at my door 6 months after the funeral, claiming that Edward owed him money. A lot of it. Elias, who had been carving a small wooden toy for Lucas, stopped what he was doing. Did he really owe him? No, Isabel answered firmly. Edward was a good man. He never borrowed money from anyone, and if he had, I would have known. But Mr. Laureano brought documents that said otherwise. Forged papers, Elias said, his voice suddenly cold with restrained anger. Of course they were forged. But who was going to believe a poor widow over a rich colonel? He told me I could repay the debt by working for him. Said Lucas would be looked after while I did what was necessary. Elias understood without her needing to explain further. He knew the kind of man Mr. Laureano was, the type who used law and power as tools to get what he wanted from defenseless women. So you ran, he said. Yes. One night I took Lucas and whatever little we could carry, and we left. We've been hiding ever since, always looking over our shoulders, afraid he'd find us again. Isabel looked down at her son, now sleeping peacefully in Elias's lap. 3 years running, she whispered, always afraid. Elias was silent for a long time, letting her words sink in. Then slowly, he began to tell his own story. He spoke of his village high in the mountains where he had lived with his wife Elira and their daughter Amaya. He told them about the morning he left to hunt deer and got caught in a sandstorm that raged for 3 days. When he finally made it back a week later, there was nothing left but ashes. His home, his family, his entire world had been reduced to smoke and dust. Who did it? Isabel asked, though deep down she already knew. Mr. Laureano Elias replied the name, leaving his mouth like a curse. He led an attack on our village, claimed we were a threat to the settlers. He killed my wife, my daughter, and dozens of others who had done nothing wrong. Isabel felt her blood turn to ice. The same Mr. Laureano, the same man who forged that debt to trap you, Elias confirmed. The same man who took everything from me. The two of them sat in heavy silence, absorbing the horrible truth. It seemed too cruel to be coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe fate had led them to each other, two wounded souls, both marked by the same monster, now finding healing in one another. So we both lost everything because of the same man, Isabel said softly. And now, Elias replied, we've found everything again together. That night they understood they were no longer just a makeshift family. They were survivors who had found each other. Two broken spirits helping each other mend. People who had lost it all, now given a second chance at joy. The months that followed were some of the happiest any of the three had known in a long time. They created a rhythm that felt sacred in its simplicity. Elias would wake before the sun and make strong coffee for them. Isabel would cook fresh tortillas served warm with honey that Elias collected from wild hives in the hills. Lucas learned how to milk the stubborn little goat Elias had bought at the market, laughing every morning when the animal refused to cooperate. In the afternoons, while Isabel sat near the doorway sewing clothes she sold in the town square, Elias would take Lucas on long walks through the hills. He taught the boy how to read animal tracks, the small round ones of rabbits, the stretched-out prints of coyotes, the eerie human-like impressions left by bears. He showed him how to follow birds to find water and how to feel the direction of the wind by watching the leaves. Why do I need to know all this? Uncle Elias Lucas would ask, skipping beside him. Because the earth, Elias would answer, is our first mother. And if you know how to listen, she'll always show you the way. If we know how to listen, the earth will always tell us what we need to know. At night after supper, Elias would tell stories, tales passed down from his people. Stories about the coyote, the clever trickster always getting himself into trouble. Stories of the spider woman who taught humans the art of weaving. Legends of mountain spirits who watched over those who treated nature with respect. Isabel listened, fascinated by the tales that were so different from the ones she had grown up with, yet just as full of wisdom and wonder. She began learning a few Apache words, and Elias in turn picked up Mexican folk songs she softly hummed while sewing. "We're such a strange little family," Isabel laughed one night. "A Mexican woman, an Apache man, and a boy who doesn't look like either of us, but loves us both the same." "The best families are the odd ones," Elias replied. "They're built on love, not blood." Lucas, who was sketching on a piece of wood with a chunk of charcoal, looked up. "Can we add more people to our weird family?" "How do you mean?" Isabel asked. "We could find other people who don't have anyone," he said thoughtfully, "and invite them to live with us." Elias and Isabel exchanged a glance over the boy's head. Lucas's generous little heart. The same heart that had once trusted a scarred stranger with nothing more than a trade for food now wanted to pass that healing on to others. "Maybe," Elias said, "if we find someone who needs a place to belong." "I'll keep an eye out," Lucas promised, nodding seriously before returning to his drawing. It was a simple life, but one that felt whole. Elias had rediscovered purpose caring for people he loved. Isabel had found safety and a partner who treated her with quiet respect. And Lucas had gained a father figure who adored him and taught him about the world in ways no school ever could. For 6 months they lived in a peace that felt untouched, so pure it almost didn't seem real. Which is perhaps why it couldn't last. It was on a crisp April morning that the first sign of danger appeared like dust rising on the horizon. Isabel had been hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she saw him, a man on a white horse at the far end of the street surveying each house with cold, calculated eyes. Even from a distance, even after 3 years, she knew immediately who it was. The arrogant posture, the slight tilt of his head, the cruel smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. Diego Herrera, Mr. Laureano's right hand. The most brutal, relentless man in his crew. Isabel's blood turned to ice. Her hands shook so badly that the sheet slipped from her grasp. She stood frozen, unable to move or breathe, watching her worst nightmare take shape before her eyes. Diego sat there for maybe 5 minutes, studying the homes, the alleys, the shadows. Eventually his gaze found hers, and then he smiled a smile that held no warmth, only menace, the twisted kind of joy found in making others suffer. Slowly, like a predator with no reason to hurry, he turned his horse and rode away. Isabel bolted into the house. Elias was at the kitchen table preparing a tincture. Lucas was playing with the carved wooden horse Elias had made him. "Elias!" she cried, her voice cracking with fear. "Elias! He's here!" The Apache man looked up at once, reading the terror on her face. "Who's here, Diego?" "One of Mr. Laureano's men. He saw me. I think he knows where we are." Elias stood, slowly, walked to the window, and carefully pulled the curtain aside. The street was empty now, but the tension lingered in the air like a scent, thick, unmistakable. Uncle Elias Lucas asked, noticing the shift in mood between the adults. "What's happening?" "Nothing, son," Elias replied instinctively, not taking his eyes off the window. "We're just talking about something." But Lucas wasn't the same naive child who had knocked on Elias's door 9 months ago. He had grown. He had learned to read people's faces, and he had developed the instincts of someone who knew what it meant to live in fear. "It's about the bad men, isn't it?" he asked. "The ones that made us run," before Isabel dropped to her knees beside her son, gently wrapping his hands in hers. "Yes, sweetheart. But don't worry. We'll take care of everything." Are we going to have to run away again? The simple question hit Isabel like a punch to the chest. She looked around the little house that had become her sanctuary. The table where Elias prepared his remedies, the corner where Lucas kept his toys, the bed where the three of them would sometimes huddle together to share stories. "Yes," she said at last, her voice heavy. "We'll have to leave." Elias stepped away from the window and knelt beside her. "We won't go far," he promised Lucas, "and we'll stay together. Always together." "Where are we going?" the boy asked. Elias turned to Isabel, and a silent understanding passed between them. They both knew there was only one place left that could offer true safety, a place where Mr. Laureano and his men would never dare follow. "To the mountains," Elias said. "To my people." The rest of that day moved like a slow-motion nightmare. On the outside, they tried to maintain normalcy. Elias went out to gather herbs, Isabel stitched clothes by the door, and Lucas played quietly in the yard. But inside, each of them was preparing to leave behind the life they had built with such care. When night fell, they bolted the door, closed the curtains, and began their real preparations. They packed only the essentials, warm clothes for the Highlands food that wouldn't spoil Elias's most crucial remedies, and a few deeply personal items that couldn't be left behind. "We can't carry too much," Elias explained as he bundled his herbs into tight rolls. "Most of the trip will be on foot through trails no horse could manage." Isabel held up her mother's wedding dress, the only keepsake she had left from her family. "Can I bring this?" "Of course," Elias said gently. "Some things are too important to leave behind." Lucas sat on the floor surrounded by his few treasured toys. He could only bring one, and the decision weighed heavily. There was the wooden horse Elias had carved for him, the little corn husk doll his mother had sewn, and a worn storybook they'd picked up at the market. "Take the horse," Elias suggested. "It'll remind you of home no matter where we go." "But will this be our new home?" Lucas asked, holding the wooden horse tightly. "Wherever we are together," Isabel answered, "that's home." They stayed up through the night, finalizing the packing and going over their plan. They would leave before dawn, following a hidden route Elias knew through the hills far from the main roads where Diego or Mr. Laureano's men might lie in wait. "How long will it take to reach the mountains?" Isabel asked. 3 days walking," Elias replied. "Maybe 4 with Lucas." "I can walk fast," the boy said defiantly. "I won't slow you down." Elias smiled and tousled his hair. "I know you can, kiddo. You're stronger than you think." As the first streaks of dawn stretched across the sky, they shared one last quiet breakfast in the house with the blue door. Warm tortillas, wild honey, and mint tea. They ate in silence, each one committing the sounds, smells, and tastes to memory this final moment of calm before everything changed. Elias slung the supply pack over his shoulder. Isabel picked up a bundle filled with clothes and keepsakes. Lucas grabbed his wooden horse with one hand and took Elias's hand with the other. "Ready?" Elias asked. "We're ready," Isabel replied with a deep breath. They stepped out into the cool, early morning. The air smelled of sage and open possibility. Stars still glimmered overhead, though the sky was beginning to shift with the promise of sunlight. They walked to the end of the street, and there Elias stopped. "Wait here," he told Isabel, handing over his pack. "I'm going to scout ahead, make sure the path is clear." He vanished into the shadows like a ghost. Isabel and Lucas stayed behind, arms wrapped around each other, listening to every sound carried by the waking day, the chirp of birds, the whisper of wind through the trees, and then faintly, the distant clatter of hooves. A horse. Isabel's heart skipped. Horses meant riders, and riders at that moment could only mean one thing. The sound drew nearer, joined by low voices and cruel laughter. It wasn't just one rider, it was several. Mama Lucas whispered, clutching her hand tightly. "Did they find us?" Before she could respond, the voices grew clearer. And then she heard it, the voice she feared most. Mr. Laureano Vasquez himself barking orders to his men preparing to close in on the house. They were too late. The escape they had so carefully planned would never have a chance to begin. As the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in soft gold, Mr. Laureano and 5 armed men surrounded the little blue door house. Each one sat atop a horse dressed for battle-hardened faces prepared to take what they wanted without question. Mr. Laureano, mid-aged, dressed like a man of status, rode at the center. His expression was smug, his vulture-like eyes scanning every corner, every crack like a predator circling its prey. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast deep shadows across his face, and his gloved hands held the reins of a jet-black horse that looked every bit as ruthless as its rider. Isabel and Lucas crouched behind a pile of stones at the end of the street, watching in horror as Mr. Laureano's men closed in on the house. Where was Elias? Why hadn't he come back yet? "We know you're in there," Mr. Laureano shouted, his voice breaking the stillness of morning. 3 years, Isabel. 3 years I've spent hunting down what's mine, what belongs to me by right. Isabel pulled Lucas tight to her chest, trying to cover his ears, but the boy squirmed, trying to see to understand what was happening. "Come out now and let's settle this like civilized people," Mr. Laureano continued, though his voice dripped with anything but civility. "Or my men will go in there and drag you out." That's when Elias appeared. He stepped out of the house as if he'd been there all along, walking toward the front door with calm, unhurried steps. In the golden morning light, he looked taller than usual, more like a warrior pulled straight from a forgotten legend. "There's no one inside," Elias said evenly. "The house is empty." Mr. Laureano let out a laugh void of any humor. A lying Apache. What a surprise. He dismounted and approached Elias. "Where are they?" "Who?" Elias replied as if genuinely confused. "Mr. T test me savage. I know they're here. My man saw them yesterday." Elias shrugged. "Then your man was mistaken." At that moment, Diego emerged from behind the house, dragging 2 bags across the dirt, the same bags they had packed for the escape. They were preparing to leave. Diego sneered, tossing the bags to the ground. Clothes, food, medicine. They were planning to run. Mr. Laureano's smile grew cruel as he drew a pistol from his holster. "Last chance, Apache." "Where are the woman and the boy?" Elias met the barrel of the gun without flinching. "I told you they're not here." "Then you're useless to me," Mr. Laureano said, raising the gun to Elias's head. That's when Isabel broke. "No!" she screamed, stepping out from behind the rocks. "Mr. T hurt him. I'm here." Lucas tried to hold her back, but he was too small. He ran after her, shouting, "Mom, no, come back!" Mr. Laureano lowered the gun and smiled a wicked, knowing grin that made Elias's blood burn. "Well, well," he said. The whole family finally reunited. 2 of his men grabbed Isabel, roughly dragging her into the center of the street. A third seized Lucas, who kicked and twisted, trying desperately to break free. 3 years, Mr. Laureano muttered as he approached Isabel. 3 years chasing what's mine. Do you have any idea what that cost me? I don't owe you anything, Isabel said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear. My husband never borrowed a cent. Oh, but he did, Mr. Laureano replied, pulling out a weathered paper from his coat pocket. 3,000 silver pesos plus interest. And now, after all the trouble you've caused me, it's 5,000. That paper's a lie and you know it, Elias growled. Mr. Laureano ignored him completely. 5,000 pesos, he repeated. His eyes settled on Lucas, held tight by Diego. Well, the boy can work it off. 10 years of labor should just about cover it. No, Isabel shouted, struggling against the men who held her. He's just a child. He's a child who'll grow, Mr. Laureano said, his voice turning darker. And I'm a patient man. That was the moment Elias moved. Like a striking coyote, he lunged at Diego, trying to wrench Lucas from his grip. For a second, it seemed he would succeed. Diego stumbled, yelled, nearly lost hold of the boy. But then a rifle butt cracked against Elias's head, sending him to his knees. Another man kicked him hard in the stomach, folding him in half. "Leave him alone!" Lucas cried out, reaching his arms toward Elias. Uncle Elias. Uncle Mr. Laureano sneered. How touching. The Apache became family. Elias tried to stand again, but another blow dropped him to the ground. Blood ran down from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes stayed locked on Lucas. "Mr. T, take him." Elias rasped, his voice raw with pain. "Take me instead." "An Apache's not worth a thing on the market," Mr. Laureano replied. Then, letting the words hang, he looked at Lucas with a sickening grin. "But a handsome boy. Now that's different." "I'll go with you," Isabel said, her voice shaking with desperation. "Leave Lucas here and I'll work off whatever you think I owe." Mr. Laureano shook his head. "You're old. Sick. The boy is far more valuable." He nodded at Diego. "Put him on the horse." What happened next burned into Elias's memory like an open wound. Lucas was ripped from the ground, his terrified screams echoing down the street. Isabel fell to her knees, crawling toward her son, reaching for him only to be kicked aside again and again. "Uncle Elias!" Lucas screamed, his small arms stretched toward him. "Help me, please!" Elias tried one more time to rise, but his body refused. All he could do was lift his head, lock eyes with Lucas, and whisper the words he knew the boy needed to hear. "I'll find you, little one. I swear I'll find you." Mr. Laureano mounted his horse, hoisting Lucas in front of the saddle like a sack of grain. The boy had stopped screaming by now, and only cried quietly, looking back at his mother and at the man he loved like a father. 5,000 silver pesos. Mr. Laureano yelled at Isabel, "Or the boy stays with me forever." And with that, they disappeared in a cloud of dust and despair, carrying away the light that had once warmed the lives of Elias and Isabel. When the dust settled and silence returned to the street, the two of them remained alone, Elias bleeding on the red earth, and Isabel on her knees whispering her son's name like a desperate prayer. The joy they had carefully built had been shattered in a matter of minutes. The night that followed was the longest Elias had ever known. Isabel couldn't stop crying, and he couldn't stop seeing Lucas's terrified face as they took him away, the way he'd reached out in silent pleading, and Elias hadn't been able to answer. The Blue Door house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now sat heavy and silent like a grave. When the first light of morning touched the horizon, Elias stood. The decision that had been forming in his heart since Lucas's cries faded into the distance had finally solidified. He rose from the chair where he hadn't slept a second, walked to where Isabel slumped at the kitchen table, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm going after him," he said. Just like that. Isabel lifted her tear-stained face. "How? They have weapons horses. You don't even know where they went." "I do," Elias answered. "Mr. Laureano has a hideout in the northern mountains. That's where he keeps the people he wants to keep under watch." How do you know that Elias knelt beside her, taking her cold hands in his? "Because that's where they took my wife and daughter 3 years ago. I was too late to save them. I won't be too late for Lucas." "You can't go alone," Isabel whispered. "It's suicide." "I won't go alone." Elias stood and walked to the window, staring toward the distant mountains where he'd once lived. "I'm going to ask my people for help." Isabel followed him to the window. "I thought you left them," she said. "That's why you came here, isn't it?" "I didn't leave because we fought," Elias said quietly. "I walked away. I was angry, hurt. I thought they wouldn't understand." He paused, remembering the harsh words he'd said, the look in his adoptive grandfather's eyes when he left. But maybe it's time to go home. 2 hours later, Elias rode out toward the mountains on the horse he kept hidden behind the house. Isabel stayed behind, tending to his medicinal plants, clinging to hope. She soon learned that waiting could be its own kind of torment. Each minute felt like an hour, each hour like a day. By the third day, when hope was beginning to flicker, she heard the sound of hooves approaching. She ran to the window and saw Elias returning, but he wasn't alone. Behind him rode 5 Apache warriors, each mounted armed and solemn with the grim focus of men preparing for war. The largest of them dismounted and embraced Elias for a long time. Isabel heard them speak in Apache, didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, affection, forgiveness, welcome home. When they pulled apart, the older man's eyes were wet with emotion. "This is Isabel," Elias said in Spanish, motioning to her Lucas's mother. The elder approached and bowed his head respectfully. "My name is Cochise," he said in a deep, kind voice. "I raised Elias as my grandson. His pain is our pain." "You'll help?" Isabel asked, barely able to believe it. "Of course," Cochise replied. "Those who save innocent children save the future of the world." Then his eyes hardened. "And besides, we have an old debt to settle with Mr. Laureano." That night, around a small fire in the yard, the men planned the rescue. Cochise traced maps in the dirt showing where Mr. Laureano's camp lay hidden, how many men typically guarded it, and the best way to approach without being seen. "It's set in a large cave," explained a younger warrior named Tarak. "There are guards posted at the front, but we know the secret paths that reach it from behind." "How many men are there?" Elias asked. 20, maybe 30, Cochise replied. "But most of them are drunk half the time. And Apaches in Apache territory, we hold the advantage." Isabel listened quietly, biting her lip to hold back tears. With every part of the plan laid out, Isabel felt a storm of emotions swirling inside her, equal parts, hope and fear. What if something went wrong? What if Lucas got hurt during the rescue? What if she never saw her son again? "He's going to be okay," Elias said softly, almost as if he could hear her thoughts. "Lucas is smart. He's strong. He'll know we're coming for him." "How can you be so sure?" she asked. Elias smiled for the first time in days. "Because I promised him I'd always protect the two of you. And Lucas believes me." In the quiet hours just before dawn, the Apache warriors mounted their horses and rode out. Isabel stood in the doorway, watching them disappear into the darkness like silent ghosts. Then she went back inside the now empty house and knelt before the small statue of the Virgin her mother had given her years ago. "Please," she whispered, "bring my son back to me." Mr. Laureano's hideout was tucked inside a natural cave deep in the mountains, a hidden place accessible only through narrow and treacherous paths. It was the perfect lair for a man who lived off theft, blackmail, and abduction. Inside the cave, he had built a sort of makeshift village with tents, campfires, and small cells where he kept his victims. Lucas was locked inside one of them alongside 2 older women and a man who looked like he'd been there far too long. Ever since his capture 3 days ago, Lucas hadn't stopped crying or thinking about ways to escape. But the bars were solid, the guards always nearby, and he was far too small to fight his way out. "Mr. T. Cry, sweetheart," one of the women murmured, brushing his hair back gently. "Tears won't bring you home." "They're coming," Lucas said, wiping his face. "My mom and Elias, they're going to find me," Elias asked the man. "Who's Elias?" "He's—" Lucas paused, searching for the right words. Elias wasn't his father, but he cared for him like one. He wasn't blood, but he loved him and his mother like family. "He's my uncle," Lucas said at last. "And he's Apache. And he's coming." Outside the cell, a guard scoffed. "Apache. They're all cowards. No one's risking their life for some little Mexican boy." Lucas turned to him, eyes blazing with defiance. "You don't know my uncle Elias. He's not afraid of anything." But inside, a small voice whispered his fears. What if Elias couldn't find him? What if he didn't even try? What if he stayed locked in this place forever? On the second night, when the cave was quieter and most of Mr. Laureano's men were passed out drunk around the fires, Lucas heard a sound above his head. It was faint, like someone shifting carefully on the rocks overhead, trying not to make a sound. He sat up on the pile of straw that served as his bed and listened. Yes, there it was again. Someone was up there. The other prisoners noticed too. They whispered to one another, alert and waiting. Suddenly, a small stone dropped from the ceiling and landed near their cell. Then another. Then another. It was a signal. Someone was trying to reach them. Lucas stood and looked up, trying to see into the dark. That's when he heard it, barely audible, carried like the wind through the cavern. A voice he knew better than any other. Lucas, hold on a little longer. It was Elias. His heart thundered so loudly he thought the whole cave would hear it. Elias had come. He was here somewhere above, and he was going to bring him home. The tears that came then weren't from fear, but from pure, overwhelming relief. I knew it, he whispered to the other prisoners. I told you he would come. An hour before dawn, when the sky was still black but beginning to lighten, the Apaches struck. It wasn't a loud or messy battle. No shouting, no wild gunfire, just the swift, precise work of hunters dealing with unguarded prey. First, they took out the sentries at the cave entrance. Then they slipped in like shadows, weaving through the tents and taking down the half-asleep men before they even realized what was happening. In 15 minutes, they had complete control of the camp. Mr. Laureano woke up to find an Apache blade pressed to his throat, and Elias crouched beside his makeshift bed. Good morning, Elias said calmly. I've come for my nephew. You worthless Apache, Laureano growled, struggling against the ropes now binding him. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Oh, I know exactly who you are, Elias replied coldly. A man who slaughters innocent families and steals children. A man unworthy of breath. For a brief moment, Mr. Rufus saw death reflected in Elias's eyes and knew that his life was hanging by the thinnest of threads. Wait, he blurted out, desperate. We can make a deal. What kind of deal? Elias asked, his voice calm, though the blade at Mr. Rufus's throat didn't move an inch. I let the boy go, and you let me live. Elias gave a smile, but it was cold, void of kindness. The boy's leaving with me either way. The real question is whether you die here or live long enough to pay for what you've done. Just then, Cochise entered the tent carrying Lucas in his arms. The boy was dirty, shaken, but safe. As soon as he saw Elias, he reached out, tears falling down his cheeks in relief. Uncle Elias, I knew you'd come. Elias dropped the knife and gathered the boy in his arms, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe. You're safe now, kiddo. You're safe. Mr. Rufus, seizing the moment, lunged for a hidden pistol beneath his blanket, but Cochise was quicker. In a blink, the elder Apache had him disarmed and pinned once more. What do we do with him? Cochise asked. Elias stared at Mr. Rufus for a long time, thinking of his lost wife, his daughter, and the countless others hurt by this man. Ending it all right there would have been easy, too easy. But then he felt Lucas trembling in his arms and remembered his grandmother's words. Revenge doesn't heal wounds, grandson. It only opens new ones. We take him with us, Elias said finally. He'll live among our people as a prisoner. He'll work. He'll serve. He'll learn what it means to have no power over anyone. Mr. Rufus tried to argue, but Cochise silenced him with a swift gag. It's a fitting punishment, the old Apache agreed. Worse than death. It'll last longer. As they rode out of the cave, the sun crept over the mountains, casting the sky in gold. Lucas sat in front of Elias, secure in his arms, chattering about everything that had happened over the last 3 days. Behind them, Mr. Rufus was bound and tied to the back of a horse, starting a long journey far from the power he once commanded. Uncle Elias, Lucas asked, as they descended the winding trail that would lead them home. Can I ask you something? Of course, kiddo. Are you going to stay with us forever now? Elias looked toward the peaks where he'd once lived, then back down the road that led to the little house with the blue door where Isabel was waiting. For 3 years, he'd run from the idea of family, afraid of love, afraid of loss. But now he understood loving was always worth the risk. Forever, he promised, kissing the top of the boy's head. I'm never leaving you again, Isabel saw the dust kicked up by the horses before she saw who was riding them. Her heart raced as she ran to the front of the house, shielding her eyes from the morning sun. When she finally recognized Elias at the lead, Lucas safe in his arms, her knees nearly gave out beneath her. "Lucas," she cried, sprinting down the dirt road faster than she ever had before. The boy leapt from Elias's arms before he could even dismount and ran straight into his mother's embrace. Their hug was so fierce, so full of relief and joy that Elias felt his own eyes welling with tears. For 3 nights, he had imagined this moment, and reality was even more beautiful than the dream. "Mama, Mama, Elias came to rescue me," Lucas shouted between laughter and tears. He brought other Apache warriors and they snuck into the cave like shadows and took down all the bad guys and— "Slow down, mi amor," Isabel said through her tears, laughing as she ran her hands through his hair. "Are you hurt? Did they hurt you?" "No, I'm okay. And look." Lucas turned to Elias, now standing beside them. "I told them you'd come. I told everyone in the prison my uncle Elias would find me. They didn't believe me, but I knew." Isabel rose to her feet, still holding her son, and looked at Elias. She didn't need to say a word. Her eyes said it all. Gratitude, love, relief. They were all there, unspoken but loud enough to be heard. Elias stepped forward and wrapped both of them in his arms, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they all felt whole again. Cochise and the other warriors had stopped at a respectful distance, waiting silently. Elias stepped out of the embrace and signaled for them to come forward. "Isabel, these are my brothers. Without them, I couldn't have brought Lucas back." Elias gestured toward the men behind him. Cochise dismounted and gave a respectful nod. "It was an honor to help," he said in careful Spanish. "That boy is brave. He'll grow strong." "Where's Mr. Rufus?" Isabel asked, noticing a man tied to the back of one of the horses. "Over there," Elias replied, pointing. "He'll live with us in the mountains now as a prisoner." Isabel looked at the man who had torn her life apart, who had tried to steal her son, who had brought suffering to so many innocent people. She felt anger, yes, but also something like pity. He seemed so small now, powerless, stripped of the authority that had once made him dangerous. "It's a fair punishment," she said at last. "Better than he deserves." Uncle Elias said, Lucas tugging on his sleeve. "Are your friends leaving now?" Elias turned to Cochise, who gave a gentle smile and nodded. "We must return, little one. But now we know where you live. We'll come visit." "Promise?" the boy asked, eyes wide. "I promise," said the elder Apache, brushing a hand over Lucas's hair. "And you promise me you'll keep learning the medicine plants Elias teaches you. A child who knows the healing ways of the earth holds real power." "I promise," Lucas said solemnly. After the other Apache riders departed, taking Mr. Rufus to his new life as a captive, the 3 of them stepped back into the little blue-doored house. Isabel made Lucas's favorite dinner, fresh tortillas, beans, and soft cheese, while the boy excitedly recounted every detail of his adventure. Elias chopped wood nearby, listening quietly, his lips curling into a smile whenever Lucas made a dramatic flourish. And when Uncle Elias showed up at the cave, "He was like a ghost," Lucas exclaimed, acting it out. The bad men didn't even see him coming. And then he said, "I came for my nephew." And the bad guy almost fainted. "I'm sure that's exactly how it happened," Isabel said with a wink toward Elias. Later that evening, after Lucas had fallen asleep in Elias's arms by the fire, Isabel and Elias spoke in hushed voices about what came next. The village wasn't safe anymore, mister. Rufus's other men might come looking for him, or worse, seeking revenge. But Cochise had offered them a choice. They could come live with the Apache if they wished. There would be a place for them there. "Do you want to go?" Elias asked softly. Isabel looked around the little house that had become their home. "I want to be wherever you are," she said at last, "and wherever Lucas is safe. Then we go to the mountains." A month later, on a crisp spring morning, An unusual little family arrived in Apache territory. Elias was finally returning home after 3 long years, bringing with him a Mexican woman he had come to love, and a boy who called him uncle, and was more precious to him than anything he'd ever known. It wasn't easy at first. Some in the tribe were wary of Isabel, unsure whether a Mexican woman could truly belong. But she earned their trust through hard work, learning the Apache language, helping care for the sick and the young. Lucas, on the other hand, blended in almost instantly, making friends, learning to ride like a true Apache, assisting Elias in gathering herbs and preparing medicine. Together, they built a new home, stone and timber, with a garden where Isabel planted vegetables and Elias nurtured his healing herbs. Lucas had a small patch of land just for himself, where he raised flowers that he used to make garlands and gifts for his friends. Mr. Rufus, just as had been promised, now lived as a prisoner among the tribe. He toiled in the fields, hauled water-chopped firewood, and gradually came to understand what it meant to have no power over anyone. With time, the arrogance that once dripped from his every word gave way to a reluctant humility, then slowly to something more genuine. His crimes could never be erased, nor truly forgiven, but at least he was paying for them in a way that might one day bring some small measure of redemption. 2 years passed in this way, and mountain life settled into a steady rhythm. Elias regained his place of honor as the tribe's healer. Isabel mastered the art of weaving Apache-style baskets and blankets, and her creations became prized for both their beauty and craftsmanship. Lucas grew up strong and spirited, speaking both Apache and Spanish, equally at home with the traditions of his Mexican roots and the ways of the Apache people. One spring morning, while the 3 of them were tending to the garden, Lucas made a discovery that filled their hearts with joy. "Look," he called out, pointing toward a quiet corner of the garden that had seemed barren. "New flowers are blooming." They were wildflowers, tiny delicate blossoms that had sprouted on their own, vibrant like scattered gems across the earth. Isabel smiled, remembering how flowers had always signaled hope throughout her life. Elias knelt beside the fragile stems, his touch gentle as he examined them with reverence. "These are healing blossoms," he said softly. "My grandmother taught me about them. They only grow where true love has rooted itself." "True love?" Lucas asked, curious. "Love that's born not from blood, but from the heart," Elias replied, looking from Isabel to the boy. "The love of a family." That evening, the 3 of them sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun dip behind the mountain peaks. The sky blushed pink and gold, and a light breeze carried the scent of the wildflowers blooming all across the land. "You know what I love most about our life here?" Lucas asked, resting his head against Elias's shoulder. "What's that, my boy?" "That no one will ever take us away from each other again." Elias and Isabel exchanged a glance above the boy's head. They had survived storms, grief, fear, and danger to reach this point. They had found one another when it seemed least likely. They had built a family from the ashes of their pain. They had created a home in a place where they were accepted, where they were safe, where they were loved. "Never again," Elias whispered, pressing a kiss to Lucas's hair. "We're a family now." "For always," Isabel added. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above the mountains, the 3 of them sat quietly together, knowing that they had found something far more precious than gold or silver. They had found the place they truly belonged. A land of second chances had welcomed them in, and they would never be alone again. And that's the end of our story. Now, I just want to take a moment to say, this story isn't real. It's entirely fictional. But maybe that's what makes it powerful. Because even though Elias, Isabel, and Lucas don't exist in real life, the emotions, the struggles, and the lessons they represent are very real. At its core, this is a story about loss healing and the kind of love that chooses you not because of blood, but because of heart. It's about how even in the darkest moments when life has shattered everything you've known, kindness can still find you. And how the most broken people sometimes become the strongest healers. I wrote this story to explore what it means to rebuild a family from pain, to find hope in places where it shouldn't grow, and maybe most of all to remind us that a second chance is something we all deserve. This story doesn't end with riches or revenge, but with something far more valuable: belonging. It's a reminder that even after losing everything, you can still find your place, your people, and your peace. So now I want to hear from you. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Did you see yourself in Elias, in Isabel, in Lucas? Let's talk about it in the comments. I read every single one. And hey, if this story touched you even just a little, consider sharing it with someone who might need to believe that healing is possible. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and keep listening to the stories your heart needs to hear. Love you all. See you in the next one.